Kind of start the recording now. So hello everybody and welcome to our session today on recommendations for publishing structured metadata on the web. This is part of the Research Metadata Schemas working group. Thank you to all of you who are attending. Thank you to the people who will be co-chairing the session and who will be giving talks as well. And thank you to Alex as well for the technical support. We have collaborative session notes. I have been adding the link to the chat, but we also have it in here and we will have it on every slide that we have. So if you miss it, don't worry about it. On the next slide, you will see it again. Let's go to start with some housekeeping. So please keep yourself muted during presentations. And for the questions, of course, you cannot unmute yourself if you want to ask your question live. Depending on how many questions, we will use the raising hand issue, or we will go just a little bit more informally. Turn your video only if you are comfortable with, and if you have the bandwidth. For instance, if you notice that your voice is breaking, if someone tells you, oh, your voice is breaking, maybe a good idea is to turn the video off. Remember that we have the hashtag for the plenary, and well, feel free to contribute to our collaborative notes, and thank you very much for joining once again. So the contributors of this session are the people that we are listing here. Some of them will not join today due to clashes and also time zone differences, but all of them have been contributing to our notes and to our slides and to our session in one way or the other. So this is the agenda for today. We will have an introduction to the working group, and we will show the guidelines for publishing structured metadata, which is our final report. And I will be taking care of those two slots in our agenda. Then Richard will show us mapping from ISO 19115 and data site to schema.org. And then we will work on breakouts. Depending how many people we have in this session, we will ask you to split evenly, or maybe we will give you the opportunity to just let us know which breakout room you want to go, so you can decide which one you want to go. There will be one breakout room that it is kind of a question and answers regarding the guidelines that we are presenting today, and we will also have a developer room. And we will be seeing there, some JSON link data tooling and validation approaches with Shackle. Then we will wrap up with the report from the two breakouts, and then we will end our session. So let's go to start with the introduction to the working group. Our working group is the Research Metadata Schemas, and we were motivated to create this working group because in the data discovery paradigms interesting group, we saw that we had data providers, data aggregators that not necessarily knew how to talk to each other. So we wanted to make it easier for them to work on some common standards so they can interact better. And this is what we are seeing here. The idea is to improve the data discoverability with a common layer facilitated by structured metadata on the web. So the idea is that we will have structured metadata on the web pages, and from this structured metadata, we will have link metadata, and we can create knowledge graphs, and that will facilitate aggregation, interaction, interoperability, etc., etc. So that is our motivation and our goal. These were our objectives when we started the group: to bring communities working around vocabularies to describe research data. We focus mainly on data sets, but we also discuss a little bit of related resources. However, our main focus was always data sets. We wanted to identify the gaps regarding the schemas that were already commonly used to describe research data on the web. One of them will be discussed today, for instance, DataCite, but there is some others like DataCat and DCAT, sorry, and we will be talking about the schema.org later today. And the idea, the ultimate goal, the ultimate idea was providing guidelines for those communities so they have a better idea on how to start marking up their websites, their landing pages, in a way that will make it easier for them to talk to others, data providers or data aggregators. We had 4 co-chairs for this working group, and we were working on a monthly basis with a monthly call. This is in red, is not the current schedule, and we will be discussing a little bit the schedule later today. We participated every time that we had a chance in the plenaries, so since the inception of the group, and we had a group mailing list. We also had a Google Drive and some documents that we were sharing, and we work a lot with discussions around them. And here we have the technical advisory board as well. Now, our group is presenting today the final report, and we are already in maintenance mode. And because we are in maintenance mode, I can show you now the whole journey for this group. So we started in the plenary 11 and plenary 12. We are in the plenary 18 now. So remember that the span for a working group is usually 18 months. So commonly kind of 6 plenaries, roughly. So we start asking about people interested in this, and it started as task force as part of the data discovery paradigms interested group. Then we will have above, and then we decided to create the Research Metadata Schemas as a working group. We introduced the group, we start working on our different outcomes with discussions, with people participating. And then we start reporting this output and this progress in different plenaries until the plenary today, when we are reporting our final outcome, which are the guidelines for publishing structured metadata on the web. So here we have the 3 main outputs of the working group. We work on a crosswalk collection because there are multiple schemas that are already commonly used to mark up landing pages on the web. So our starting point and what we did at the beginning was a crosswalk collection. So that was our first output. And then we produce a guidance document, which is the guidelines that we are presenting today. That one is the main output, but we also work on some tooling supporting the crosswalks and mainly. So we have a visualization of the crosswalks, and we also have some toolings that might help and make easier the resources, the markup of the resources. So we also collected this information. So that was the introduction for the group. Now we are going to move to our main output, guidelines for publishing structured metadata on the web. I don't think we have any newcomers, but just in case, I'm putting the collaborative notes again in the chat. Sorry. So what we wanted to do was finding a common way to describe data across different resources. And we want to keep it as simple as possible. We didn't want to come up with a new vocabulary or with a new ontology. And we want to do it in a way that it would be easier for a lot of people, a lot of communities, a lot of providers and aggregators to adhere to these recommendations. So we wanted to keep it simple as much as possible, but also to allow complex things to be modeled in case that was needed. And very important, it should be understandable by both humans and machines. We work mainly on crosswalks with schema.org, so having schema.org as a reference vocabulary. because it is commonly included already in a variety of sectors, and it is a common thing for web pages. So that's why we decided to use kind of schema.org as a reference vocabulary, as a reference schema. By using these common recommendations, by using these common standards, then we are enabling things such as the summaries that we see nowadays when we are searching for anything on the web, because it becomes easier to aggregate data from different websites and then show you pictures, but also show you a summary and also show you even some scientific elements in there, as we can see here with the scientific name. And that was the idea, to make things easier for aggregators and for people willing to do some federation, some federated queries across different data providers. So the purpose with these guidelines, what we did, what we wanted to achieve, we wanted to provide recommendations on how to add a structured markup on websites. And we wanted to do so. The data repositories could make the data more discoverable over the web, following these recommendations. And then the publishers could also expose their metadata. And the aggregators could take all that metadata and put it all together, and to contribute to fairness for metadata and for data sets. And the findability was key for us. What we didn't want to do was providing recommendations on exactly which schema to use. Although we use schema.org as a reference, our recommendations are broad enough for you to tailor it with DataCite or DCAT or other vocabulary that it is common to your community. And we didn't want to create new schemas or to extend existing schemas. There are some communities already trying to extend and making extensions of existing schemas for their specific disciplines. So we didn't want to go there. We didn't want to provide information on how search engines work or how search engines are going to find your website and how the ranking works. We didn't tackle that. And we cannot offer support for the implementation of the markup, because that will be tailored to your production environment. So we didn't go there. Now, this is our final output, that it is already available. The document, you can go to the working group space, a wiki space in the Research Data Alliance pages, and you will find already all the text corresponding to the 9 recommendations that we came up with. It already passed for the community consultation period. We already tackled all the concerns that they were raising there, plus some recommendations directly from the Secretariat. So let's go through our 9 recommendations. It's very important that since the very beginning, you clarify the purpose of adding a structured markup to your web pages. Do you want to enable data discovery? Do you want to adhere to a common standard followed by your community? You want to enable metadata exchange, or you want to connect other relevant resources? Depending on your purpose, you might need to add more or less markup. You might need to go for some broad schemas or for some specific tailored to your community. So it is very important that you know what is the purpose of adding the structured data to your websites. Then you need to identify what are the resources that you want to add, what are the resources that you want to mark up. You don't have to mark up everything. There is no need. What you want to mark up will be depending on the purpose. So once you know the purpose, you can identify the resources that you want to add markup to. It is very important that you provide persistent identifiers for the resources that you are marking up. This is aligned to citations principles, this is aligned to persistent identification, and this is aligned to the findability on the FAIR principles as well. Then we recommend adopting, or if there is nothing available, developing a crosswalk. It might be that there are different vocabularies, different schemas that you can use. So it is a good idea to use to create a crosswalk or to see if there is already one available that it is useful for you. So you know the different possibilities that the possible vocabularies are offering you, and then you can make a better informed decision about which one you are going to use. You should also see whether you need to incorporate any external vocabularies. Sometimes it is recommended to use some external vocabularies or at least to map to them because, again, they will be tailored to your community. Then you should follow to the next step, and then you will be implementing the markup. And then you need to check what is the format that you are going to use, what is the syntax behind that format, so you follow best practices and best community practices, so you are compatible to others in your community. You should be friendly to web crawlers and to scrapers. Having a sitemap is always a good idea. We know that if you are a website, if you are a data provider offering something like 100 million of pages, you don't want to have a sitemap with 100 million of elements in there, but there are ways to create smaller sitemaps and to link them. So you should go for it and provide a sitemap because it will make the navigation much easier. So collecting information out of your whole website will be easier as well for crawlers and maybe some others data aggregators in your community. Make the best use of available tools for mapping, for generation, and for validation of structured data. You need to go again to the community. You can see, based on what I have been telling you, that community is really key in here. And document every step. And if you share that documentation, it's even better because then you are transparent about the markup that you are providing, what was the purpose, how you decided on the resources, and what you are offering with your markup. There is that transparency, that openness that we are welcoming more and more nowadays, particularly when it comes to research. And find and join a community, but maybe the find and join a community is kind of a recommendation that it is present in all of the other ones, because you need to know what your community is, what your audience is, so you can tailor things for you to better interact with them. And those are our recommendations. No, we should not have the breakout session now. This slide is wrong. We should have the session by Steve. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing right now. Yes, and while Stephen gets ready for him to start with his presentation, we have one question in the chat. What would be your recommendation on how to find existing crosswalk mappings? Well, there is our crosswalk mapping, of course. We will recommend that one. That one is available as an output. If you belong to any community working already in markup, it's likely that they will be offering these crosswalks. I know that some crosswalks have been published already in fair sharing, and this is the information that comes to my mind right now. If anyone else knows about any other way to find markup splits, add it to the chat or add it to the collaborative notes. So thank you very much. And now let's continue with our next talk. Steve, please, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Good morning. I'm assuming you can see me and see my screen, so I'll just move ahead. I'll be talking this morning about a case study in integrating using the structured data on the web based on some existing catalog work that we've done. This was actually engineered fairly early on in this RDA workgroup activity and probably needs some updates relative to the final outputs. But anyway, how come that's not changing? we go. Okay, so just background. The work I was doing here was with the Interdisciplinary Earth Data Alliance at Lamont Doherty Observatory, which is a system of several different data systems, including a marine geoscience data system, Earth Chem Library, and an Arctic Data Center archive. And so what we were doing was creating an integrated catalog for all the data sets that were being handled by the repositories at AIDA. The process we were using was the metadata for these databases, or for these repositories, content was in different databases associated with the different repositories. So what we did was create ISO XML metadata from each repository following a standard set of conventions for using the ISO metadata, and then harvested that to a GeoPortal catalog server. So this system was up and running, and then as we were moving along, we wanted to integrate with Data One and also the EarthCube Geocodes project that Doug Fils and Adam Shepard were working on, which was called P418, was working at looking at schema.org metadata. So the Data One harvest they were moving towards, this was the first experiment at Data One with harvesting schema.org metadata. And we were also working with this EarthCube activity to develop some patterns for using the schema.org. Following that, there was an EarthCube project called the Data Discovery Studio, where we were aggregating a lot of ISO metadata, again, using the GeoPortal server catalog. But this was a situation where we were harvesting metadata from a lot of different earth science data repositories. There's currently about 1.6 million records in the catalog. And what we wanted to do was expose the metadata in that repository for Google dataset search. So again, using schema.org metadata. So in both cases, we had ISO metadata that we wanted to get into schema.org from an existing system. So that was the setup. We were using this GeoPortal server, which is an open source catalog system that was originally developed by Esri, but is now as a separate open source project with quite a few users. And the interesting and useful thing there is that this catalog system generates the dataset landing pages using a XSL transform, using the XML metadata that's in the catalog. So the idea was to generate the schema.org JSON LD as scripts embedded in the dataset landing pages, embedded in the HTML, using the XSLT, the existing XSLT workflow that was implemented in the GeoPortal server. And then on top of that, we generated a sitemap for the repository content. And we did this directly from the metadata database, just because it was easier to do that. So the mapping we actually did was largely based on an unpublished compilation of metadata properties and mappings that I've been working on over the years in collaboration with Ted Haberman and working with USGen and AIDA, and also in the EarthCube context. So some of the challenges in this mapping at the nuts and bolts level. So at the one level, we have, there's mapping between this field has the same kind of information as some other field, but when you actually get down to brass tacks and you want to transform between two metadata formats, there's a lot of little gotchas that you have to deal with, things like date formats that you have to make consistent if you want to have an interoperable catalog. In a lot of cases, there were properties in the source metadata that weren't really accommodated very well in the target metadata schema, in the schema.org. So in some cases, we chose to just take the text from these unmapped properties and concatenate them as part of the description or as part of a text field. Have to deal with different spatial representations coming from the source metadata. So sometimes you get points, sometimes you get bounding boxes. In our case, we had a convention with our ISO metadata that everything should have a bounding box. So that simplified things fairly dramatically. But you still have to deal with things like, well, what do you do around the anti-meridians when you have bounding boxes that cross 180 degrees longitude. Another problem that emerged was dealing with special characters that would work and weren't a problem in the XML, but if you just took that and put it in the JSON, you end up with things like double quotes, carriage returns, things like that. that would break the JSON. So then there needed to be a lot of not a lot, but basically a special template in the XSLT to deal with getting rid of special characters so they couldn't gum up the JSON. So these are just a few of the problems we had to address in actually implementing the transform. So the workflow that we followed for developing this was, first of all, we developed a list of, I mean, these are the variables in the XSL, but the idea was, what's the content we're interested in? And this is based kind of on the first step in the workflow that Lael just described, which is, what is the purpose? And we were mostly focused on the discovery use case in this. So we looked at what's the kind of content that we have in our source metadata that we're interested in getting into the schema.org metadata. So we had a list of, okay, here's the content items we're interested in. And then associated with each one of these content items, then within the XSLT, there was a process to figure out where's that information in the source metadata and where does it go in the target metadata. And I won't delve into the details of how the XSLT works, but it's just that. So the mapping is embedded in how these variables are done. There isn't a separate mapping table. So anyway, so we populate the variables and then assemble the JSON LD text output. Just again, in terms of mechanics, we wanted the transform to be workable, to be usable not only in the GeoPortal, but also in other using, if you were writing Python code or working in a browser. So we have to work with XSLT 1.0, which is XSLT. There's a version 2, which has some much more useful functions for doing this kind of stuff that make things easier, but it doesn't work with in a lot of transform environments with the available software tools. So we were stuck with version 1. So I just wanted to flash on a couple of things of what this actually looks like in practice. I'll show the Data Discovery Studio with a quick search. How the JSON LD is embedded in the HTML. A quick look at what the XML looks like, and then how we're doing a transform. I use the Oxygen tool for working with the XML with a Saxon 6.5 XSLT processor. And then also what do the results look like in the Google dataset search. So I'll flip over to, so here's just a quick, so this is what the Discovery Studio looks like. This is actually I just picked at random one record here. In the Discovery Studio, we can look at the full metadata record. We can see the original XML. And this was originally configured to work with the schema.org validation tool, but Google has changed where the validation tool is. So we have to update these links. They don't actually work at this point. But when you look at the full metadata record, this is what the HTML looks like. It's transformed from the ISO XML. It has basically all the ISO content is here, and you can look at the full content. It shows you the bounding box for where the dataset content is located. If you look at the source for this page, what you see is that embedded in that, in the header here, there's a script, which is of type application JSON LD. And this is where the schema.org description of the data set is embedded. And then we have the sitemap set up for the Google to be scraping this. So if you go into dataset search and look for this particular data set, what you see is it shows up. And the interesting thing here, of course, is that, here's the data set, it's there. But you can see that it's actually, that content has been harvested not only from the Data Discovery Studio, it's also been harvested from Open Topography, and also I think directly from that. So Google is doing some interesting stuff, building on this. I think this must be a different data set, but it's in a slight, so it shows the location. But you can see Google is doing a really good job of actually identifying metadata records that are about the same data set, even in cases where there might not be an identifier for the data set. That's an interesting thing to keep in mind. So if you are thinking about Google dataset search, it's really, it's kind of interesting to look at, is my data already there before you do a lot of working. In terms of the Schema Validator, I can take the URL for this HTML page that's generated from the GeoPortal, and I just plugged it in here. and you can run the validation test on it using it, and it shows up as a data set. And here's the content that Google is extracting from the schema.org metadata that it has scraped from that web page. So that's the connection with the Google dataset search. In terms of the XML we're looking at, so here's our list of variables, and the XML record looks like here. And then we can run a quick, the transform. Here's the JSON that actually ends up getting embedded. So the way the XSLT works is there's just a subroutine that gets called from the original XML to HTML transform that runs and injects the JSON that it produces into that web page. So a lot of the mechanics were simplified by using the GeoPortal to streamline this workflow. So I think one of the important lessons learned from here is, again, it goes back to some of the guidelines, this idea of what are you trying to do and what are the content items you're interested in. But to get a useful transform that's going to work in your target application, it's important to have a pretty clear profile, the conventions for how the metadata are encoded, what are your date formats, or how are you encoding locations, what vocabularies are you using in your keywords, how are you describing the data set distributions. And so you have to really understand what those conventions are in the source metadata and also in your target metadata application. So just quick links to where is all this stuff. So there's a GitHub repository linked here, and that metadata, the actual XSLT is in that repository. There are a variety of other transforms in there as well. Sorry. So this is what the content looks like. So there's transforms for using, between ISO and FGDC metadata. I didn't mention the DataCite work, but there's also a DataCite to schema.org transform here. There's EML and ISO. So a variety of different transformations that we developed over the years for these catalog systems that I've been working on. The GeoPortal code is also in GitHub for the data discovery GeoPortal that I showed. And here's the search, the link for that the Discovery Studio interface if you want to play around with that a little bit. So this is an example of actually how to go from having an existing catalog system with ISO metadata to having schema.org metadata injected into the dataset landing pages that can be harvested by the Google Dataset Search. We've also experimented with harvesting it into the EarthCube Geocodes catalog. In the AIDA case, we were using that approach to integrate the AIDA metadata into Data One. So it provides a good mechanism for making your metadata available to lots of different aggregators for a broader visibility of your data products. So that's the presentation. Thank you. Any questions?
Please feel free to raise your hand to ask questions to Steve.
Link to the slides. Yeah. So where's a good place to put the presentation? I'll talk to Leo about that.
Okay, perfect. Then we can share it on the.
Yeah, certainly. But I'd be happy to share it.
Thank you so much. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Heinrich.
Yes. Hi, interesting talk. Yes, Heinrich from DKC. So the main goal is here that your data are visible and discoverable via Google Data Search, right? And to set in other metadata aggregators and discovery services. So my questions, are you fine how they are visible and discoverable in Google Data Search? Or so Actually, the background of myself is that I come from EU.B2Find, and we have a totally different harvesting approach. So we are harvesting directly and have created metadata then in the cross-domain level. So, and Google data search is great because they have a large coverage, but are you fine with the quality of the metadata? And you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, so the interesting thing, and I think, that yes, there are certainly some flaws in what Google Dataset Search is doing, but there are a couple of good things about it, in that it is really good, it seems, at identifying metadata about the same data set, and it also provides links back to the original sources for the most part. And so it's a good high-level kind of search, and it provides the hooks you need to get back to the detailed information, which I think is a useful way of doing things. I think Data One is kind of using a similar sort of approach with a link back to, when they harvest metadata, they provide a link back to, is there a full EML record or a full ISO record of some sort that has more, or likely has more content in it. So it gives you a way to link back to that. So they don't try to solve all the problems at that high level, which I think for doing a real cross-domain search it's probably a good 80% solution, because there is so much heterogeneity.
Okay. Yeah, interesting. So I'm not only involved in B2Find, but as well I come from the German Climate Computing Service, and we have the WDCC, so for the World Climate Data Archive. And there we have a lot as well of ISO 19. So it's very interesting. So yeah, the whole metadata world is harvesting one from the other, and then you have a different level and a lot of aggregators. And yes, but so this is the world. So
yes, and it creates immense problems with synchronizing when metadata gets updated. And you probably have that. I haven't seen a good solution yet.
Yeah, I think so. Thanks.
I don't see any other hand. So I think we can, oh yes, Martin.
Yeah, I just had to raise my hand when you when you asked. Something that I find still a challenge, but I don't know what progress this group has made, or for example, your experience, Richard, is sort of what is metadata that are essential, optional, etc. So it seems like a wild world out there where people put with schema.org on their pages, which is fine in a way because it's very flexible. But if you aggregate, you want to see some consistency, and you can always search for this or that. What's your take on this, or your experience?
Well, it's interesting. In the data discovery studio, we're trying to really aggregate across a lot of these different ISO providers, NOAA, NASA, lots of NASA data facilities. We had about 15 or so different sources. And, at first we thought we would be able to have some fairly tight constraints about what kind of content had to be present. But in the end, we realized it boiled down to, well, we'll take anything if it has a title that's more than 10 characters long, and there's some kind of URL that tells you something about how to get it. And the idea there was, it was better to err on the side of having more content, or more data sets in the catalog, even at the cost of not having very good metadata. And well, I'm sure everybody here is well aware that our biggest problem in this arena is really the metadata content and getting good metadata content. A lot of the technology would be relatively straightforward if we had reliably good content that followed some conventions. So that's what it sounds pretty pathetic, but that's kind of where we ended up. Is basically give us a title that isn't isn't a one-word string and give us some kind of URL that tells you, would help a user figure out more about where it is and what it is. Yeah.
Okay,
that's one end of the spectrum.
So in the validation tools that this group has built or others have built, there is no concept of required metadata, but it's still all the, if you use a title, it should look like this, but it's still very flexible. There's no aim of enforcing, well, you should at least have these 5 properties for every data set or stuff like that. That's not where you have gone with this exposing metadata activity.
I think one of the really useful ways that we would be good, you don't see very much, but I think is an important, and the progress is being made. There's a W3C working in the semantic data on the web working group about profiles. And I think one of the missing pieces in a lot of what we're doing is the ability in the metadata records to say, be explicit about what kind of profile, what conventions does this record follow, which would be very helpful for knowing, if I'm going to harvest this record, look at it, what can I expect? And also from the point of view of the harvester, it means you say, oh, ideally you would have you could do content negotiation to get the metadata following the conventions that your aggregator expects. And there's some missing pieces. To be able to do that, we'd have to have some kind of way of registering profiles and also some conventions and consistency about people describing profiles and really thinking about what are the conventions we're using and are we being consistent within, as the originator of the metadata, are they being consistent about how they're composing the metadata?
Thank you.
We also have a comment on this regard from Douglas on the chat. This might be a job that communities have to take over, and that is our experience with bioschemas as well.
Right.
If there is a community telling you, look, this is what we need, and this is why we need it, and if you do it in this way, then you are enabling this. It's easier that if there is kind of a very broad generic thing telling them like, oh, you should do this, because they will ask, okay, why? So yeah, community is again a very important part in all this. Okay, I'm going to stop the discussion there. Thank you again, Steve, and thank you for the questions from the audience.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity.
And now I'm creating 2 breakout rooms. So one is, let's going to rename. So we will have the question and answers about the guidelines, and then we will have the developer room. So they are open. Feel free to join any of the 2 rooms, so you can discuss further the guidelines, or you can join the other room to see some more elements about validation using Shackle and things more tailored, more technical a bit, to say this somehow. I will remain here for a moment, but I will be joining the room number 1, the room about questions and answers for the guidelines. So nothing much will be happening in the main room. So please join one of the two rooms so you can participate from the discussion.
I'm missing my button to join the breakout room.
Do you want me to assign you to any of the two rooms, Martin?
Oh, that would be wonderful if you send me to the developer room.
Developer, okay, I will send you there. Anyone else that cannot see the join a room button that needs help? I can assign you to a particular one. Okay, I will go to one of the breakout rooms now. If you need any help joining any of the two breakout rooms, please ask Alex. Alex is host of the session, so she can also send you to one of the rooms. Thank you. you a link. I will send you a link in a moment so you can share, so you can upload the presentation there.
Thanks.
I will do this on the chat. Try there and let me know if you don't have access. I will give you access. I think I can give you access. So, Doc, do you want to, or someone from your group, I don't know who you designate for this task, would want to present a summary of what you discussed on the breakout room?
Oh, well, I suppose it's on me to do that. So within the breakout room, we really just kind of went through some of the approaches inside Shackle and looked at some of the ways it can be implemented and utilized in that. We just had probably about 10 minutes worth of discussion then that we went through and really, I think this kind of talked about, are there ways in which, for example, you can make associations between a data graph and a Shackle shape or set of shapes that it may be compliant with. And then also, I think discussing the role of communities and what their place is in the structure for defining these validation approaches. So.
Good, thank you. Did you discuss by any chance Shackle versus checks?
We did not. I didn't give anyone an opportunity to do that.
Okay, good. Good, thank you very much. So let's going to move to a short report from the other breakout room. I will do that presentation. So we didn't really go into the discussion, into a further in-depth discussion of the guidelines. We have newcomers in these breakout rooms, some people that were starting with their own crosswalks for some domain-specific tasks, for instance, in engineering, mechanical engineering, also people that were working on domain-agnostic data and material sciences. And we also have someone from ORCID, so we discussed a little bit about how ORCID was being used by other people, maybe having data repositories or publication repositories, whether they were using it as a way to know that one author is the same one, regardless of difference on the names and so on. And I think, yeah, we have some people also working on data catalogs and publications repositories, and they are starting on the markup, so they still have some work to do on there. And that was mostly what we were discussing in our breakout room, so not much about the guidelines, but some use cases that people have in there. And potentially the recommendations could be useful for them, so they can follow the recommendations and maybe follow examples by other communities, for instance, Science on Schema and Bioschemas, and to see what they have done. So they can also do a similar exercise, similar crosswalks for their particular domain. And that was it for our breakout rooms. I'm going to check, we are fine with time. I'm just checking the wrap up. And for the wrap up, I want to ask you, please fill in the survey. If you go to the working notes, then you will find there a link to the survey. It is at the very beginning. There is an arrow survey. There is also, I can actually put it in the agenda right now, in case, I think I put that, please fill in the form, the survey in 3 different places in the collaborative notes. The idea with this survey is for us to know how to continue with the efforts of this group. What we want to do mainly is supporting adoption by now, but we are open to other topics as well. And we need your help to figure out how our working group should continue now that we are in maintenance mode. We need to define who would be interested in participating. We need to know who would be interested in participating in the meetings. What would you expect from the meetings, your time zone, so we can find a suitable time, more or less for everybody. And also the frequency of the meetings. And we really want to hear from you. So please fill in the survey. So that's it. Just remember that you still can join our working group, so you get updates about adoption and maybe adoption stories and so on. And that was it for our session today for this plenary 18. Thank you very much. Thank you again to Steve for the presentation and to Alex for the technical aspects. And thank you everybody for joining us today. I really hope that the recommendations will be useful for you, for your data repositories, data catalogs, data sets, and feel free to join the mailing list and let us know if you need any help using our recommendations.
Right. Thanks, everyone.
I think we can stop the recording now. Thank you, Alex.